This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBary. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
All right, well, welcome to our first official night in the book of Daniel. We actually started our study in the book of Daniel last week, but all of last week was pretty much introductory material for studying the book of Daniel. So tonight we're going to be in Daniel chapter number 1, and so I'm glad you're here. I knew there were some folks that weren't going to be here with us tonight because of the funeral, and I promised them we would record it for tonight. If you missed last Sunday night's introduction to the book of Daniel, there's a recording of it on the church's Facebook page. You can listen to it on there, and I hope you'll do that. Go back and pick that up. And tonight we're going to start with Daniel chapter number 1. Daniel is, of course, it's an exciting book of the Bible to study because it contains some of the great Bible stories that you learned growing up. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and others of the great stories that are recorded in the book of Daniel. But it's also a very exciting book to study because in the Old Testament, it is the book of prophecy about the end times that is the closest comparison we have to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And, of course, Revelation is an exciting book to study. We actually studied it a little bit less than a year ago in our Sunday school class on Sunday mornings with the adult Sunday school class. But Daniel is the Old Testament companion to the book of Revelation. And in some instances, there are some of the prophecies that are recorded in the book of Daniel about end-time events and people that are more detailed even than what we find recorded in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So, it's going to be an exciting study, and let's dig in now to Daniel chapter number 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it." All right, now I want to stop here at verse number 1. We won't go through all of the background that we talked about last week as we were preparing to begin our study of chapter 1, but remember, there are 3 different times that King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came to Jerusalem to besiege the city of Jerusalem. I think perhaps a bit of explanation here is important before we launch into the rest of the chapter here in chapter 1. And that is, this is an event that takes place well after the kingdom of Israel had been divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. You remember the kingdom of Israel as a united kingdom only had 3 kings. There was Saul, David, and who was the last? Solomon, that's right. Saul, David, and Solomon. At the death of King Solomon, the kingdom was split in 2. The 10 northern tribes, who were actually in rebellion against God, they split off and created the northern kingdom that continued to be known as the kingdom of Israel. That's the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel. Then you had in the south, where Jerusalem, the capital, was located, you had 2 tribes that were remaining. And those 2 tribes formed their own kingdom that continued to exist well after the first kingdom had already gone into captivity. What was the name of the southern kingdom there? The kingdom of Judah. That's exactly right. And the kingdom of Judah was comprised of 2 tribes. Judah, which was by far the larger of the 2, and what? And Benjamin. Benjamin was the territory of the tribe of Benjamin was like the hole in the middle of a donut, with Judah's territory being the donut around the hole. And those 2 tribes together made up the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the 10 northern tribes from their very beginning were in idolatry. In fact, as soon as the 10 northern kingdoms formed the kingdom of Israel and split off from the rest of what had been Israel, they set up 2 golden calves to be worshiped up north, because the king of the northern kingdom of Israel didn't want his people going south to Jerusalem to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, because he didn't want his people to owe any allegiance to the southern kingdom of Judah. And so he had erected for the people of the northern kingdom to worship 2 golden statues, 2 golden calves. Just like the children of Israel were dancing around at the foot of Mount Sinai when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments. And here they are worshiping false gods again in the history of Israel. Of course, that's something that happens frequently in the history of Israel in the Old Testament. It's kind of a never-ending cycle. But because of their idolatry and their worship of false gods, the Lord allowed the northern kingdom of Israel to be taken over in 721 BC by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, as we talked about, were some of the most ruthless people in the ancient world. And when they captured a people, they would take them out of their cities and scatter them, spread them out throughout their empire, because if they weren't back in their homeland, and if they weren't gathered together with a bunch of like people, they were much less likely to rebel. So the 10 northern tribes had been scattered by the Assyrian Empire in 721 BC. They are sometimes referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They're lost to the degree that they, even to this day, their descendants do not know their lineages, and much of that record keeping was lost. But you can mark it down. God still knows who they are. And one day in the end times, God will be bringing them back to the land. God knows who they are. But that left the southern kingdom of Judah. The southern kingdom of Judah continued to exist for about another 140, 150 years, because from time to time they would have a king who would bring about a revival there in the kingdom of Judah. There were a number of good kings in the south, unlike in the north. But finally, in 605 BC, we had the first besieging of the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Several other prophets had already prophesied that because of Judah's idolatry and them not learning from the lessons of the 10 northern tribes, they too were going to go into captivity. Which one of the prophets was it that had prophesied that Judah would go into captivity to Babylon? Anybody remember which prophet? The prophet Jeremiah. In fact, he not only prophesied that they would go into captivity to Babylon, he gave the exact number of years they would be in captivity before they would be allowed to return to their land. The number of years, Jeremiah said, was 70 years. So here is the kingdom of Judah sitting right on the edge of the fulfillment of a prophecy where they're going to be taken out of their land, away from their homes, away to Babylon for 70 years. Now, if you think about that for a moment, what that means is that most of those who were adults would never see home again. And most of their children would be born in faraway lands, never having seen their homeland and never having seen the glory of God in what used to be Jerusalem and Judah, and never having seen the temple of God. Unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves here in verse number 1. Nebuchadnezzar comes up and besieges the city 3 different times: 605 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC. This particular occurrence in verse 1 is at the time of the first siege of Jerusalem in 605 BC. Now, I drew the timeline on just an abbreviated timeline up here on the whiteboard so that you could get a little bit of a sense of where we are in history, both for Israel and also for world history. You remember in when we're looking at a timeline, when you're looking at those years before Christ, we're counting closer and closer to zero. So we start with the bigger number and we move closer and closer to zero as we get to the birth of Christ, and then we start counting upwards to where we are today. So on this timeline, I'm only showing up to the birth of Christ. So here we are back 600 years before the birth of Christ. 605 BC to be exact. Some of the other events that I just put on here just to give us a frame of reference, 400 BC will be the last Old Testament prophet whose writings are recorded for us in the Old Testament. Does anybody know who the last Old Testament prophet was whose words are recorded in the Old Testament? Malachi is correct. Malachi is not only the last chronologically, he's the last one whose book is included in the Old Testament. And at the end of, Malachi's writing, there's no more revelation from God for the next 400 years until shortly before the birth of Christ, when the angel announces the coming of both Jesus and John the Baptist. Those 400 years in the history of Israel is known as the silent years, because God was giving no new revelation to Israel, in large part because of Israel's iniquity, their sin. Not until the coming of the Messiah will Israel hear from God something new. But other than that date of 400 BC, which is the finishing of the Old Testament, here are some events from world history that you might remember. First of all, in 509 BC, the Roman Republic is founded. That's, of course, not directly mentioned in the Bible, but that was something that was going on. So at the time of Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem, it's still another 100 years off in the future before Rome is even going to be founded as a republic. Rome, that will later become the great world empire. It's nothing but a little bitty village on the Tiber River in Italy at this point. It'll be another 100 years before the Roman Republic is ever founded. And then 490 BC, after that, is the Battle of Marathon. That's that famous battle where the Persians invaded Greece with an army that was said to have been perhaps even 1 million men in all, the largest army of the ancient world, invaded Greece, and the Greeks fought them at the Battle of Marathon. That's that famous battle where the Greek runner ran back all the way from the battlefield to Athens to let them know the outcome of the battle, and that's how we get the word marathon being related to running a marathon, because the runner literally ran back with word of the victory there. Then the other date I put up here is Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. His empire, of course, was short-lived, but was a huge empire in terms of not only the territory he conquered, but also the impact it had upon the ancient world as well. So there are just some events to give you some framework. We're still 100 years before any of those events even start in ancient history, at the time that Babylon besieges Jerusalem for the first time in 605 BC. Verse 2, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." So here we have the name of the king who was ruling in Jerusalem for the kingdom of Judah at the time. It's King Jehoiakim. He was the ruler of the kingdom of Judah in 605 BC. So we have some very exact time frames here to know when these events are occurring. And it says here in verse 2 that God gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Just as the prophet Jeremiah had said was going to happen, it happened. Jerusalem is besieged by Nebuchadnezzar, At this time, Nebuchadnezzar could have done a lot of things, could have taken a lot more than he took, but he settles for only taking the king and some of his family and some of the silver and gold vessels that were used in the temple in the worship of God. If you'll remember in our introduction last week, we talked about how King Hezekiah, years before this, had foolishly shown the wealth of his own house and of the temple to some of the ambassadors from Babylon who took word back to Nebuchadnezzar's daddy and grandpa about the wealth that was in the temple there in Israel. As a result, now Nebuchadnezzar's here and he wants to collect some of that and take it back home. Also note here that these vessels that were taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, not only are they, well, they're important because Nebuchadnezzar's taking back the wealth of Judah. It's also going to be important, though, because later in the book of Daniel, we're going to see these same vessels being talked about again after Nebuchadnezzar is out of the picture. So remember these vessels being taken out of the temple for later on in the book. Verse number 3, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So Nebuchadnezzar tells his man in charge here at the siege, once the siege is over, he said, listen, get together the king's children and the royal families, the nobility, if you would, of the kingdom of Judah. Gather all their children, their young people up, and let's take them all back to Babylon. Now, why would Nebuchadnezzar want to take back to Babylon the children of the king and the nobility? TR? TR, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Who is it that's the most likely to lead a revolt? It's going to be the children of the former king and the families related to the former king, the nobility and the king's family. They're the ones that are most likely going to be chosen as the leaders of any rebellion that might come of things down the road. So the Babylonians are going to take all the king's kids and all the children of the nobility back to Babylon, and as TR said, indoctrinate them as Babylonians, give them important jobs, important titles, and good-paying salaries, so they'll be content and they'll be less likely to participate in any potential revolts down the road. Also, though, think about this. The king's children and the children of the nobility no doubt had received whatever the best education was that was available in the kingdom of Judah before this. So he's also getting the best and brightest, most educated young people of the country they just conquered and taking them back so their brain power can be put to work for the Babylonian Empire. So it's actually a pretty smart idea on several fronts. It placates them, appeases them, makes them less likely to rebel, and it also benefits the bureaucracy of the Babylonian Empire. Verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So here are all these young people that are taken from Jerusalem back to Babylon. And the man that is in charge of seeing that these young people from Judah become good Babylonians, not only is he going to be responsible for their instruction, but for feeding them and providing for them for that 3 years that they're in training, if you would. And it tells us that he gave them the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. They were given the same foods to eat that King Nebuchadnezzar was eating. The best of the best that Babylon had to offer. Don't you imagine, for most people, being treated like royalty, even though they're not back home, they're going to be very unlikely to want to rebel against something when they're being treated like royalty themselves, but Babylonian royalty. Verse 6. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and unto Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So here we have these 4 Hebrew children that we're going to see periodically throughout the book of Daniel, and then the ones who will be changed, have their names changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But initially, those are not their names. Daniel is Daniel, but the other 3, just like Daniel, have Hebrew names. Their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their names are being changed from Hebrew names to Babylonian names. What year was this? Mary, this would have been right along with 605 BC. It would have been very shortly after, probably in the months right after the siege was over and they were taken back. So what's the purpose then of changing their names from Hebrew names to Babylonian names? Brother Shaw? That's right. It's part of that process of making them Babylonians so they'll forget who they are. They're indoctrinating them into their culture. That's right. TR? All 3 of you are right. I like the word TR threw in there, their heritage. They're removing their heritage, their Hebrew heritage. And, you know, we're teaching through the book of Daniel, but any teacher that's worth anything will do a little bit of preaching along the way. So Sean just opened the door for me here. What we see here happening to these Hebrew children is what Sean said. It's the very same thing happening in America today, where our children are being told they should be ashamed of their heritage growing up here in America. Their heritage is being robbed from them. They're growing up the way the enemies of our liberty want them to grow up, without any sense of who they are or where they came from. Mary's right. You know, here where we live, our Southern heroes and Southern heritage has been under attack for a long time, almost 50 years. But now we're to the point, it's not just our Southern heritage, it's our American heritage.
Northern heroes.
They're telling us that even George Washington, Patrick Henry, Christopher Columbus, we have to not be proud of our heritage and who we are. It strips away that identity, that sense of who you are, your belonging, so that then they can remake our young people into what they want them to be much easier than they could. That's what they're doing here to Daniel and his companions. By the way, I thought you might find it interesting to know the meanings of their names. Now, last week I gave out some notebooks to anyone that wanted one. If you have your notebooks or something you want to take notes on, you might want to jot these down. They're interesting when you see what their names meant and what their names were changed to. Daniel means God is my judge. God is my judge. And of course, the God of Israel is Jehovah. The name Daniel, though, God is my judge. You can't help but have a name like that and be reminded that the reason Mama and Daddy named you that is because they believed strongly in God, and undoubtedly they inculcated Daniel growing up with an understanding that God is my judge. Boy, if you walk around with a name that means God is my judge, that's going to be a pretty good reminder throughout the rest of your life that I'm accountable to God. Daniel, God is my judge. Then Hananiah means God is gracious. God is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. Who is like God. Aren't we created in the image of God? And aren't the children of Israel the chosen people of God? Well, Mishael means who is like God. And then the name Azariah, the fourth of the Hebrew children mentioned, his name means God helps. So all of their names had something to do with Jehovah. And it was a reminder to them that their parents gave them the names they gave them to remember throughout their whole lives that God is to play a part in their lives and in the life of Israel or Judah. Yes, ma'am. Hananiah, God is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. And Azariah means God helps. So their names all have to do with things related to God, Jehovah God. But the names the Babylonians give them are for that same purpose. Their names are being changed now to Babylonian names that all have their meanings related to different Babylonian gods. We see it's not even cryptic what they're doing. It's right out in the open. Here's what their new names mean. Daniel, whose name was changed to Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar means Bel protects, B-E-L. For those of you that were with us on Wednesday nights this past summer, we talked about Mystery Babylon, the religion of Mystery Babylon. And you remember that the name Bel from the Babylonian religion is really the same God in the mystery religions as Baal of the Canaanites. He's the same God that we find in the Roman religion of Saturn, the Greeks, Kronos, the father of the gods or the king of the gods. It's really another name when you look at the story of these ancient mystery religions that all have identical stories, but with different names for the gods and goddesses. It's the name for Satan himself, the king of the pagan gods. So Daniel, whose name meant God is my judge, speaking of Jehovah, now his new name means Bel protects, named after the chief god of the Babylonians. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach. And the name Shadrach is related to the Babylonian god Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K. Very similar to the Egyptian equivalent of Osiris in the mystery religion stories. Mishael's name was changed to Meshach. Meshach's, the name Meshach is related to the Babylonian moon god Aku, A-K-U. So another of the Babylonian gods. Then we have Azariah, whose name is changed to Abednego. And Abednego means servant of Nebo. And Nebo was another of the Babylonian gods. So here we have 4 Babylonian gods: Bel, Marduk, Aku, and Nebo. Whereas the 4 Hebrew children previously, their names all were related to Jehovah, now they're related to 4 different Babylonian gods, all for the same reasons that we've already talked about up till now. By the way, the name Nebuchadnezzar is also related to the Babylonian god Nebo. I looked up the meaning of the name Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know if you find it interesting, but I thought it would be interesting to know what his name means. Nebuchadnezzar means protect my eldest son. And it's a prayer to the god Nebo. So Nebuchadnezzar's daddy, when he named Nebuchadnezzar, was asking their god Nebo to protect his eldest son. And that's who Nebuchadnezzar is. And that's the reason for Nebuchadnezzar's name. So here we are with the 4 Hebrew children. They've got new names. They're in a new place. They're being asked to eat a brand new diet of food once they get back to Babylon. You know where that's going. You've studied or read the book of Daniel before. Verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Verse 8 is the key verse for chapter 1 in the book of Daniel. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart. That is, Daniel made a conviction. He made a conscious decision he was not going to defile himself, even with the best of the best that Babylon had to offer. I think there's a good lesson for all of us in this. Daniel didn't just accidentally become the man of God we see later in the book of Daniel. It happened because he, with purpose, made the conscious decision he would not defile himself. You and I would do well to purpose in our hearts to make a conscious decision to consecrate ourselves to God, just as Daniel did. It says that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. I think there are at least 2 reasons why Daniel, and we're going to see the other 3 Hebrew children mentioned with Daniel as his companions, refused to participate in partaking of the king's meat and the wine which he drank. Those 2 reasons. First of all, we talked a little bit this morning in our adult Sunday school class about the dietary laws that God gave to Israel in the Old Testament. If you want to see those, they're found in Leviticus chapter 11. We looked at them this morning because we're in the book of Acts, and we're to Acts chapter 10, where we're about to talk about the things that they were supposed to eat and not eat, and how they were considered by the Jews to be clean or not clean. Well, that's because God said in Leviticus 11 there were certain things that the children of Israel were not supposed to eat. Some people have argued that that was primarily for their health, and I'm sure it kept them in good health to some degree, kept them from eating things that weren't good for them. But it was also especially to set Israel apart from all the nations around them, because the other nations around them didn't observe these strict dietary laws. So it set them apart, or sanctified Israel as a distinct people, holy unto God. So part of the reasons that Daniel and his companions probably didn't want to eat the foods of the king that were put before them is because it probably included some of those things we talked about in Sunday school this morning that you and I like to eat, but that the children of Israel weren't supposed to eat. Barbecued pork, catfish, shellfish, and on we could go with the list, but things that the children of Israel were not supposed to eat. So I'm sure there's a certain amount to this that Daniel's saying, hey, we're not supposed to eat these things. we are forbidden by our God to eat these things. But I think, not just that, not just the not defiling themselves with the king's meat in that regard because it was a violation of the dietary laws, but as we see later in the New Testament, frequently being addressed by the Apostle Paul, it was the practice of the pagans in ancient times that before they prepared their meals, they would take the food that was to be prepared and they would say the blessing over it and offer a little portion of it as a burnt offering of sorts to their favorite god or goddess, asking their pagan god to bless the food, to bless the meal, much the same way that you and I sit down at our meal like we did at lunch today, and we ask the Lord to bless the food. Well, they asked their gods to bless it. But in so doing, they were dedicating the food to their gods before they prepared it and ate it. I think Daniel, perhaps, realized that that was what the Babylonians did because it was the custom of most of the ancient world. And he said, we don't want anything to do with any of the food that's been dedicated to the gods of Babylon to be prepared for King Nebuchadnezzar. We don't want to partake of that. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. And you think about it and you say, well, it was just food. It was just food. But was it just food? TR? It was a conviction and the belief that God had given to Israel. So this was more than just the fact that it was food. Sorry? How far will sin take you? That's right. If you open the door a little bit, we leave it open for sin to go farther. Daniel purposed in his heart. Look at verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Just like Joseph that we studied about in Genesis, Daniel is well liked even by those that don't know him. Obviously, he's a good young man, a respectful young man, and he finds favor even with his captors. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Now the eunuchs, of course, were servants of the king. And these servants, they were totally dedicated to the king's service. They were all unmarried, and their loyalty was 100% to their king. He says, Daniel, you don't understand. The king gave specific instructions what you are to be fed. And I'm in charge of that. And if you don't get what the king said you're supposed to get, then when you come back before the king and the king says, why do these four fellas look like they're not doing so well and the rest of them are all fat and happy? He said, if they look healthy and you don't look healthy, I'm going to be blamed. I'm going to be responsible, and it could mean my head. Look at verse number 11. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. What is pulse? It's going to be vegetables and grain, just vegetables and grain. No meat of any kind, just the vegetables and grain. Give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. He said, for 10 days let us eat nothing but vegetables and grain, and let the rest of those you're in charge of eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. And at the end of the 10 days, you see for yourself who looks like they're doing better, and then you make a decision. Well, they're supposed to be under his charge for 3 years, so I guess he figures 10 days, I guess I can take a chance on 10 days. We're not going to do too much damage or lose too much ground in 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. So here we see Daniel, because he purposed in his heart not to defile himself, he takes the first of what's going to be many stands because of his faith in God. And because he takes the stand, God blesses him and the other 3 Hebrew children that are his companions. They all look healthier than the other Hebrew children. And as a result, they're allowed to continue with the same diet for the rest of the 3 years they're under his command, under his charge, if you would. I've wondered before, if we would see Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children in some of the later things we find in the book of Daniel, taking stands for God, if they had not taken this stand for God. When you look at it in comparison, this stand over what they eat, it seems much, much smaller, humanly speaking, in comparison to the stands we see them taking later in the book. When Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and when the other 3 are thrown into the burning fiery furnace. And yet I wonder, had they not taken this stand, would they have had enough character and conviction to take the stands they took later? We would all do well, I think, to notice that. Daniel purposed in his heart. I think we could say the other 3 purposed in their hearts. It was no accident, but because of their conviction and their stand, their faith is strengthened, and God's going to prosper them because of their obedience and their faithfulness. And our time is up. We didn't get through all of chapter 1, but we almost finished chapter 1. We'll stop here for tonight. Any questions or comments as we close tonight? Questions, comments, observations?